Delighted to be here, an economist in the midst of all you health specialists. I'm honoured. Yeah, I know this is a very cheeky title. So, facing so many health professionals, let me make one thing very clear. I'm not talking about these, okay? Don't eat these. They're not very good for you at all, and they're not actually very nice. So I'm not talking about donuts of that kind. What I am talking about, however, is the image of a donut, the shape. What you see in your mind's eye when I just say the word donut. Because what you see in your mind's eye is incredibly powerful. Pictures are very, very powerful, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The power of pictures, partly, and think about it, whatever kind of communication you do, what kind of pictures are you using? You see, pictures are powerful because they're deeply memorable and because they can be paradigm changing. Copernicus knew that. Back in the 1500s, Copernicus was watching the movement of the planets, and he knew that Ptolemy over here, who'd put Earth unmoving at the centre of the known universe, Copernicus knew that Ptolemy had it all wrong. But Copernicus waited until he was on his deathbed before he dared to publish his own alternative picture, because he knew that by putting the sun, not Earth, at the centre of the known universe, he was threatening to upend papal power, challenge church authority, and question man's place in the universe. So it's extraordinary what havoc a few concentric circles can unleash. Copernicus drew us a new map of the known universe. But what we need today actually is a new map of human well-being, which is why I'm so pleased to be here and part of this community talking about planetary health and understanding finally the deep relationship between human health and well-being and planetary health and well-being. And let me present you with what I offer as a picture to put in your mind's eye of a map of what human well-being and human progress could look like in the 21st century. And yes, it looks like a donut. So in the middle of that donut is a place where people are falling short on life's essentials, where people don't have enough food or health, water, education, housing, access to networks, energy, social equality, political voice, peace and justice. These are the 12 social priorities that are set out in the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So you could say that these are the most contemporary statement of internationally agreed minimum standards that every human being has a claim to, of course deeply based on human rights since the 1940s. So every person in the world has a claim to being out of that space of deprivation, so that every person can lead a life of dignity, of opportunity and community. So we want to leave nobody in the middle, get everybody into the green space. But, and it's a very big but, we cannot overshoot that outer crust, because there we start to put so much pressure on this extraordinary living planet that we begin to kick its systems out of kilter. And as Andy was saying earlier, we've come from the Holocene. We are the inheritors, the children of the Holocene. The last 11,000 years on this planet have been extraordinarily stable and benevolent temperatures and conditions for humanity to thrive and multiply. And it was in 2009 that a group of Earth system scientists got together and said, what is it about this phase, the Holocene, that's made it such a home sweet home for humanity? And they came up with what they think are the 9 planetary boundaries within which we must keep our pressure on the planet so that we have a stable climate, healthy oceans, a protective ozone layer, bountiful biodiversity, ample fresh water, healthy air to breathe, and unpolluted soils. So these are the 9 planetary boundaries, and we cannot overshoot these either. So for me, this is a compass of human well-being in relation to planetary well-being in the 21st century. Can we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, to put it as most simple? Well, if it's a compass, we need to know where the needles are. And that's not a pretty picture, because we are over and below on all accounts. Millions, billions of people are falling short on their most basic needs. For food, that little red wedge goes 11% of the way towards the centre of the circle, because 11% of people are undernourished. On water, 13% of people don't have access to improved water. 32%, 1 person in 3 has no access to what we would call a toilet. And if you want to look at the data for this, it's both in my book but also in a paper I published in the Lancet Planetary Health, the April edition of this year. The whole thing is set out with all the data there. So we're falling short on every single social boundary. And yet, we've already overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries. On climate change, on fertilizer use, phosphorus and nitrogen loading, massively on biodiversity loss and on land conversion. As Andy said, we don't even know where we are on air pollution and chemical pollution. We could be over up to at least 60. So this is the state of humanity at the beginning of the 21st century. Can we be the generation that actually begins to turn this story around, that actually begins to bring ourselves into the space where we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet? It's certainly never been done before. What would it take? Well, it would take many things, some of which have been talked about already. Stabilizing the human population, redistributing resources between those people in that population, within nations and certainly between nations. That's going to take ingenious technology, and that demands brilliant governance from the village to the United Nations. It's going to change our aspirations of what we even think a good life is. It's going to depend on time. We're already late, but we don't have all the time we would like to take, because planetary boundaries will at some point kick themselves into tipping points over which we have no longer a chance to come back. But it also takes education. And he talked earlier about imagination challenges. And that's the place where I want to focus now. Because I could talk right up to the coffee break about all the extraordinary dynamics and interactions between these, but I believe previous speakers have done that brilliantly. What I want to do is go to the question of education, and a particular discipline, economics education. I'm talking about that because economics is the language of public policy. That's the reason I studied at a university 25 years ago. I wanted to help change the world. Who doesn't? And I believed I needed the language of public policy to help me be equipped to make that difference. But what I learned deeply frustrated me. And I believe actually that the diagrams, those pictures again, that sit in our mind's eye, every economist has these diagrams sitting in their visual cortex. But even if you've never studied economics, I promise you, these pictures are shaping the way you think about the economy and what it is, because they shape the way that politicians talk about it, journalists write about it, we hear about it on the radio, business people think about it. These pictures shape what we think the economy is, what it's for, who we are, how it works. And I'm going to just take you on a little tour of some of those issues, and I'm going to dive into a very relevant subset of my entire book on this. The economics textbooks are filled with these pictures, but these textbooks, here's the great anomaly. When you go back to the root of the word economics, it means household management, ecos nomos, the management of the household. Ecology, of course, comes from the same root, understanding the household. There's a sweet arrogance to economics, which is that it allows you to enroll and take and complete a degree about learning about how to manage the household without learning diddly squat about understanding the household. There's actually no requirement at all to learn about the household on which the entire human economy and activity is dependent. There could be no better guide. Let me take you back through the 20th century mindset through which we're all operating. There could be no better guide than this gentleman. This is Paul Samuelson, and he was teaching at MIT in the 1940s. He was brilliant. And Samuelson knew one thing that many of today's professors don't get a chance to do. So busy publishing in the top journals that you don't get points for writing textbooks, right? Samuelson knew that that was where the power lay. He said, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or drafts its advanced treaties so long as I can write its economics textbooks. What he says next, the first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. You see, Paul Samuelson thinks your mind is a blank slate and he wants to lick it. And of course he already has, because the diagram he drew of what the economy is still shapes what we all think the economy is today. Teaching at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he was teaching engineering students. So when he sat down to draw a diagram of the economy, he made it easy for them. He drew it looking like a radiator system. Here we've got business and public, we would call public households today. And you've got these tanks round which money, water, you can see it's water being pumped in, is flowing round and round. The idea is that income flows around and around the economy. It's an important concept about the circular flow and multiplier effect. Trouble is that this diagram has changed only a little bit in the past 70 years since Samuelson first drew that. Today it looks more like this. Any economic student knows it's the circular flow of income diagram. We've got the essential relationship of the market between households and business, where households exchange their labour and their capital in return for wages and profit, and that income they use for consumer spending, in return they get goods and services. And so the income, the money goes round and round, and so do the resources. Yes, there are some leakages coming off it. Not all money is spent as consumer spending. Some is taken as savings by banks. Some is taken as taxes by government. Some goes off for imports from overseas. But it gets re-injected as investment by banks, as spending by governments, and money coming in from exports. Well, there's more than a little lie in there, that the idea that banks merely take your savings and turn it into investment. That little lie actually underpins why we didn't see the financial crisis coming, the fact that banks actually create money. I'm not even going to talk about that. Because there are some blind spots in this diagram that are so extraordinary that they are shaping the conversation in this room. This diagram, of course, is focused only on tracking what gets monetized. And so it makes absolutely no mention of the living world. All the material and energy that are drawn daily into the economy is spewed out as waste and pollution. It makes no mention of the unpaid caring work of parents, the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the children, doing it all again tomorrow, that makes labour fresh and ready for work at the factory door every day. And it makes no mention of the commons, the place where people collectively organise, not with the market, not with the state, but as communities. Whether it's to share water in their rice paddies, or to create a community garden on the corner of our block, or to create Wikipedia online. And if you're going to ignore the living world, the unpaid caring work of parents and communities, and the collective action of communities, you're ignoring some fundamental bases of our well-being, and those blind spots will come back to bite us. Of course, this is still the biggest picture of the economy that any economist can show you. And if they were here today, maybe there are some here today, but if economists were here today, they would say, well, you're making a big fuss because of course we recognise the living world and we dress it in environmental externalities. Well, if you're going to call the living world an externality, you've already told me how important it isn't. You have pushed it to the margin of your frame, that the market is central and that the living world and care and the community is peripheral. This is an utterly outdated mindset of economics if we're going to have half a chance of living well in the 21st century. What about who we are? Because it's about human health and human interaction in relation to the planet. Well, the story of who we are goes back to Adam Smith. He had a nuanced picture, actually. Smith knew that self-interest is important for making markets work, but that our interest in others is essential for making society work. And he celebrated our sense of justice, public spirit, our sense of generosity. He said these are the traits most valuable for society. But this nuance got in the way of economic modelling, which wanted to reduce humanity as if it were an atom at the heart of some sort of economic physics. And so when economists such as John Stuart Mill came along, they said, well, political economy doesn't address the whole of humanity, it just recognises man as a being who desires to possess wealth, plucked out that self-interest characteristic and made it the DNA of humanity at the heart of economics. Today we know him as rational economic man. He's not actually drawn in the textbooks, but if he were, he'd have to look something like this. He'd be a man, standing alone, money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the problem with this portrait is not just how absurdly narrow it is, it's what looking at him does to us. Because on being told that he is like us, we actually become more like him. And this was the most fascinating thing I learned in doing all the research for my book. The more that economic students learn about the traits of rational economic man, the more they say they value self-interest, and the less regard they give to altruism, generosity, cooperation. If we're going to be more than 10 billion human beings on this planet this century, and we continue to imagine, justify, and conduct ourselves as rational economic man, I think we stand very, very little chance of thriving here together. What about what the economy is for? This story goes back to Simon Kuznets, a brilliant economist. In the 1930s in the US, he was asked by US Congress to come up for the first time with a single number to measure the output of the economy. And he created what we now know as national income, or GDP. But when he created it, he gave it with a caveat. He said, you could scarcely infer a nation's welfare from this measure. Because as Kuznets wrote in his own papers, it doesn't include the unpaid caring work of parents. It doesn't include the value created by communities. He didn't actually recognise all the living world. That came later. But goodness gave us the caveats from day one. But the temptations of having a single number by which to measure your success year on year. And then when you get in the 50s, comparative tables between countries, you've got the US and the USSR. Now a horse race is on. So much so that GDP became a metric that became the de facto goal of economic progress, the measure of success. And by the 1960s, W.W. Rostow here wrote a book. I love it so much I bought myself the first edition. It's called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. And he described the process of economic growth as a 5-stage journey. First, you have traditional society in which nothing very much is happening. And then you have what he called the preconditions for takeoff, where you get the beginnings of a finance industry. You change the education system to prepare people to be workers. The nation must be touched with a certain nationalism and a belief that growth will be good for something beyond itself, like a better life for the children. Then you get takeoff itself, where growth becomes the normal condition and the march of compound interest begins to bear its blessings. This moves through to the drive for maturity, where you can have any industry you want, no matter what your natural resource base, and it ends in the 5th and final stage, the era of high mass consumption, where people can buy all the consumer goods they want. Now, you can hear the implicit metaphor of an airplane ride here. But this airplane ride is unlike any other in one way. It can never be allowed to land. He left us flying off into the sunset of mass consumerism. And Rostow even knew this. He said in the pages of his book. And then the question beyond, when history offers us only fragments. What to do when the increase in real income itself loses its charm? Rostow asked the question, but he never answered it, and here's why. He was about to become an advisor to the presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy was standing for election in 1960 on the promise of a 5% growth rate. So Rostow's job was to keep that plane in the sky, not to ask if and how it could ever be allowed to land. So I put those pictures together, and I believe that this underlying mindset of economics has played a very large role in driving us on this journey to the brink of collapse, where we have a 21st century economy that can make Dorito-flavored Mountain Dew, that can make extraordinary technologies, and yet millions, billions of people still fall short on their most basic needs. And we have already overshot the planetary boundaries and the systems of this planet on which we deeply depend, because it falls into the blind spots of the theory by which we construct our economy. So how do we turn this round? I believe we need a new narrative. We need to turn that round. And I believe it comes with new pictures. First, purpose. What is the purpose of the economy? It should be to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. So how do we do that? If I could show economics students, those who are about to begin at this university, London universities in this autumn, about to enroll to learn economics, what's the first diagram they'll see? Probably supply and demand and Samuelson's circular flow. I would show them instead this, that the economy is embedded within society, embedded within the living world, drawing in materials and matter, spewing out waste and pollution. And that the economy is made up not just of the market and the state, this 20th century boxing match between, are you a laissez-faire capitalist or a state-loving socialist, but also of the household, where we begin every day in the space of unpaid care, and the commons, where we organise collectively, without the market, without the state, to create things we value. And that finance is a service sector, in service to the real economy, in service to life. Fancy what that would look like if that was the kind of finance sector we actually had. Humanity? We're not rational economic man, we're far more interesting than that. Yes, we can be self-interested, but we are also socially reciprocating and cooperative. How do we nurture our nature to bring that out? We're not isolated, but deeply interdependent. And we're not dominant over nature, at the pinnacle of nature's creation. We are deeply embedded within the web of life. And the sooner we get this new self-portrait, the better, because who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. So any discipline that dares to tell us who we are bears a great responsibility for reshaping who therefore we become. What about economic design? I believe we need to put two principles at the heart of 21st century economic design to make it distributive and regenerative by design. Distributive in the sense that value created should be shared far more equitably with all of those who helped create it. Employee-owned companies rather than shareholder-owned companies that draw the value off to shareholders who never even stepped in the company threshold. community-owned housing, not wealthy investor housing pricing Londoners out of their rents. Putting ideas in the Creative Commons, not always under intellectual property rights. These are some of the ideas that are already happening of distributive design, but also regenerative. Instead of the 20th century economy where we take Earth's materials, make it into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away, this linear degenerative industrial system, we need to bend those arrows around, creating a circular or cyclical economy where materials are never used up, but always used again and again. And lastly, what does that mean for growth? If we're pursuing an economy that's actually regenerative and distributive by design, what's the future for GDP growth? Look to nature. Many things in nature grow. From my children's feet, they're aged 8, they're very expensive the rate of growth of their feet at the moment, to the Amazon forest. Things grow, but then they mature and come to thrive. And in fact, anything in nature that tries to grow forever destroys the system on which it depends. In our own bodies, we call it cancer. But the economic system, as Rostow described it, has the march of compound interest, the growth being a normal condition, structured into its institutions. So we're on a collision course there. We need, instead of being on an airplane ride, to be like a kite surfer who works with the wind and the waves and adapts between the two of them with a bar going up and down. I think the future of GDP growth is like a bar going up and down, becoming an adaptive response variable rather than something that must always increase. That's a century-long transformation. So, I leave you with the compass. As communicators, we need to think carefully not just about our words, but about the pictures we share, because they're extremely powerful, remaining in our visual cortexes for our lives. And if you're interested in my book, I bought a few copies along today, which I could sell you at all the prices, and I've got a few little handouts as well I'd be delighted to share with you. I look forward to questions. Thank you.